From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, this is From the South, and I'm Sweeney Gray. A Brazilian appeal court has not only upheld the corruption charges against former President Luiz Ignacio Lula da Silva, they've increased his sentence from 9 to 12 years in prison. Lula was convicted of accepting bribes and money laundering. This ruling dashes his hopes of running in this year's presidential election, even though he was favored to win. An electoral court will now decide on a final decision regarding his candidacy. Lula responded to the ruling afterwards.
I am extremely calm and aware of what is going on in Brazil, and I am absolutely sure I have not committed any crime. I can tell you that those who have judged me will have less peace of mind than me.
Reaction to the ruling was swift throughout the streets of Brazil. Hundreds of Lula da Silva's supporters took to the streets of Porto Alegre to protest against the court's ruling. Lula was also joined by former President Dilma Rousseff and more than 70,000 people at a rally in his defense.
Whether the trial is politically motivated is a key focus. We think that those opposing Lula are trying to deprive him of his rights through other means, since they can't beat him via general election.
In the municipality of Estancia, protesters blocked streets and burned tires. This tweet says the protests were done in defense of democracy. Attorneys for Lula da Silva have issued a statement on the ruling, calling it political prosecution and a miscarriage of justice. Attorneys Cristiano and Valesca Martins also held a press conference after the ruling. They said the property which Lula da Silva is accused of owning was never registered in his name or any of his relatives. They maintain Lula was convicted without proof and therefore never received a fair trial. And British Queen's Counsel Geoffrey Robinson called Brazil's entire judicial system flawed, saying there was no presumption of innocence in the case, and he accused the chief judge of prejudging the issue.
Now, of course, the behavior of judges is conditioned by the system of the country in which they work. And it's been my privilege to act for Lula in taking aspects of his case to the United Nations Human Rights Committee, which is a court that Brazil has signed up to, that sits in Geneva, 18 experts in Geneva.
We are now joined live by sociologist Sabrina Fernandez in Brazil. She's been following the case. Good evening, Sabrina. Lula's lawyers are calling this ruling a miscarriage of justice and political prosecution. Do you see it the same way?
I see this is exactly what is happening right now, and I would say that justice is the correct word. We've had a problem with the judiciary in Brazil for a while right now. The Lava Jato investigations are very biased, even though they do look into right-wing politicians. They don't go any further into those negotiations. The trial of Lula was clearly sped up in order to get in the way of him becoming a candidate. However, it is not precisely this trial that's preventing him from being a candidate in the presidential run. That would be the official Limpa law or the clean slate law. So I would call this a problem with the bias of the judiciary right now, but this is not necessarily stopping Lula from running just yet.
Yeah, but with people in the streets protesting in support of Lula, do you see the Brazilian public losing faith in their own judicial system?
This is certainly what is happening, but right now Brazil is going through a problem of deep polarization in the country, and because of this, there are people also celebrating. In parts of, in some towns, in parts of the country, you can actually hear people with fireworks celebrating Lula's conviction.
Okay, so and what do you think is going to happen in October for the elections with Lula out?
Right now, what we expect is that Lula won't be out just yet. He's going to go through every step of appeal until the end of it, until he reaches the Supreme Court. This allows him to be a pre-candidate, so continue the pre-campaign period as he's been on for a while, touring the country and so on. He's even expected to be traveling to the African continent very soon, so we don't think that's going to stop right now. There's no arrest predicted for Lula at this moment, even though he's been sentenced to 12 years. So we expect that he's going to be in his pre-campaign mode until the last minute possible. And then if his appeals are not successful and he's not going to be ineligible to be a candidate until all of his appeals fail. So if his appeals are not successful, then we expect that the Workers' Party is going to replace Lula with the Plan B candidate endorsed by Lula.
And Sabrina, one last question. There's a lot of international interest in this particular case. What sort of message do you think this decision with Lula da Silva sends to the international community?
It definitely shows that there's a crisis happening in Brazil. It's not just an economic one, but a political crisis. Right now, we saw today the market soaring because of Lula's conviction. So we know there's a problem related to how the ruling class is connected to these judiciary proceedings and Lula's conviction right now. So there's a message that there's a problem with the judiciary. There's a problem with how politics have been conducted since Dilma Rousseff's impeachment and right before that. And in a way, that's a reaction to how people were moving in June 2013, demanding fairer processes, demanding proper laws and proceedings against corruption in the country. And there's this problem of polarization. And I would urge everyone else to keep an eye on what's going on in Brazil this year, because not everything you see and not everything you hear is going to be dealt with the honesty that's necessary to make sure that all of the proceedings this year are fair.
Thank you so much. We've been talking to Sabrina Fernandez. She is a sociologist about the recent ruling that was upheld in the case of former Brazilian President Lula Ignacio da Silva. We move on to Venezuela now, where the Minister of Communication, Jorge Rodriguez, has rejected the statements of the Lima Group in which the government of Nicolas Maduro has been criticized for holding presidential elections on April 2017.
The Bolivarian government of Venezuela, along with the Dialogue Commission, rejects the vulgar and disrespectful comments made by the so-called Lima Group. The OAS secretary, Luis Almagro, leads this illegal right-wing opposition group against the sovereignty of Venezuela. We repudiated the interventionist statements that intend to violate international law. This group tries to prevent at all costs the elections for April 20th of 2018. The Venezuelan government will not attend to foreign threats of any kind, and the more sanctions are made against our nation, the more elections will be held. Is there something more democratic than an election process? The formula that President Maduro found to face the violence of the opposition coalition in the months of April was to build a peaceful electoral process.
All this came after Venezuela's Constituent Assembly has called for new elections within the next 3 months. The move came as a surprise because the election had been expected to take place in December.
The announcement of the election came on January 23rd, a symbolic day for the country as Venezuelans celebrated the overthrow of dictator Marco Pérez Jiménez in 1958. To commemorate the 60th anniversary, people mobilized and marched in the streets of Caracas.
Elections in Venezuela are telling the world that we are a free country, that we have sovereignty, transparency, and social justice. The empire wants to destroy Maduro's government, and I ask myself, how dare it? Doesn't it know that Chavez woke the people up and gave them a face, a voice, and broke people's chains?
This confirms that we are a true democracy, a democracy that solves differences between the Bolivarian socialists and the opposition with elections. This means that the UN must stop trying to dominate Bolivar's and Chavez's country. We will go to the polls on April 30 and ratify the candidate for the revolution.
The person in charge of announcing the election date was Diosdado Cabello. He did it in front of the National Constituent Assembly and then went to the Caracas streets to confirm his message: more sanctions, more elections, referring to the recent sanctions from the EU, which he says will not stop the Venezuelan economy.
After the aggressions, after the attacks and the sanctions, we will respond with popular power. It's the people who decide. In Venezuela, there is no imperial power ruling. It is our people who will decide. That is why we called for elections and will let the people be the ones who make all the decisions needed to face this economic war.
In Venezuela, the people who are free, independent, powerful, and united are the ones who rule. Nobody tells us what to do. Those were the main reactions to the election announcement. The Minister of Communication, Jorge Rodriguez, also confirmed that the elections will be the best political way for the country to face its inner division.
We will spread a message of peace, and we will walk together with the man of peace, the person who defended peace in our country, the man who stood up to the North American empire, the rudest and the meanest government in U.S. history, the government of Donald Trump.
After the People's March, President Nicolas Maduro said he will be one of the candidates in these elections. The official candidate for the GPP alliance will be announced on February 4th. During the National Congress celebrations, Maduro said that the latest sanctions from the EU won't remain unchallenged because Venezuela can't be destroyed.
The EU sanctions came from Donald Trump's rotten government. It was obvious that the US Undersecretary for Political Affairs, Thomas Shannon, headed to Spain to the corrupt government of Mariano Rajoy to convince the EU to approve the sanctions.
The National Electoral Council will announce the election schedule and the exact date. This will be the 25th election since the Bolivarian Revolution took power. The leader of the Democratic Action Party, Henry Ramos, announced on Twitter that Freddy Guevara and Enrique Capriles have called for unity within the opposition MUD coalition in order to present only one candidate.
Trinidad and Tobago and Venezuela are very close to a final energy deal. The president of the Constituent Assembly, Delcy Rodriguez, led a delegation that met Prime Minister Keith Rowley in Trinidad. The Venezuelan delegation included the president of PDVSA and the vice minister for the Caribbean. Both sides say they're very close to signing the final agreement. And with that, we head to a break. More news in a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back. In Peru, authorities are bracing for flooding after heavy rain hit the Chosica district in the Lima province. 1 year after El Niño Costero heavily affected Chosica, people are now fearing similar destruction. The Rimac River overflowed, damaging the district's pipes. Power lines were also affected. Chosica's mayor, Luis Bueno, claimed the government promised reconstructions after El Niño, but they never materialized, adding that the municipality is now trying to use its own resources to face this new crisis.
We constantly live in a state of fear because authorities are not keeping their promises. They come only when they feel like it. Otherwise, they leave us behind. Yesterday, the mayor promised to bring rocks to protect us who are living in the area, but that didn't happen. It's already noon and no one is here.
Unfortunately, we are in the hands of corrupt people. When these things happen, when will this end? We're asking the central government to speed up the reconstruction. We know they changed the people in charge, but we are hoping that the reconstruction could happen soon because we are in the middle of the rainy season.
And Peru's Congress has passed a law allowing a highway construction in a protected zone of the Amazon rainforest. For more on this story, we go to our correspondent in Lima, Veronica Insausti.
Hola, ¿cómo están?
Just 3 days since Pope Francis left Peru after calling on politicians to protect the Amazon, the country's Congress passed the law despite concerns from the public about the dangers involved. The Pope had spoken in Puerto Maldonado on the predatory nature of capitalism, appealing to the country's leaders to protect nature, especially the Amazon, and to make sure indigenous communities are not excluded. The decision from Congress was immediately met with alarm from Amazonian communities, who say it will have a huge impact on national parks and reserves, including one of the most biodiverse natural reserves in Peru, as well as affecting indigenous communities. The law is being imposed in zones which have yet to undergo deforestation. Amazonian community leaders argue that the new highways will benefit narco-traffickers and other illegal businesses. While there will be better access, the Congress is putting the Amazon and indigenous people at risk.
We thank Veronica for that report. Mexico's ties with the United States have weakened after Donald Trump's first year in office, especially after his threats to build a wall between both nations. Our correspondent, Pablo Perez, has the story.
When he was deported from the United States to Mexico, Diego Miguel left his only son behind, along with the life he built for 12 years. He was deported for not having a driver's license. Once back in his country, he faced unemployment, a similar situation to that of his colleagues, with whom he created the group Deportados brand, a screen printing business.
This keeps me occupied. This also helps us collect funds to keep the shelter that we have here, and where we receive deported people that have nowhere to go.
The same happened to Ana Laura, who was deported just as she was trying to regulate her immigration status. Now she lives far from her family and cannot return to the United States in the next 20 years.
With Trump in office, the anti-immigration policies have strengthened, and racism grew towards the immigrant community, especially the Mexican one. Now the United States is deporting people that have been living for years in the country.
Security has increased in the border and will get even stronger if Trump gets to build the wall between both nations. Prototypes of the wall were already built in San Diego.
The wall has to be difficult to climb or to scratch. It has to be safe enough for the agents to patrol.
People have protested against the wall outside the U.S. Embassy in Mexico, as Washington continues to insist that it's Mexico who will pay for the wall.
Actually, the wall has existed for many years now, but maybe not in the dimension Trump has thought about. But I really think this is disrespectful to humanity. We all have the same rights and the same freedoms. He is exceeding the limits with these projects.
From his presidential campaign, Trump threatened to tax car and auto parts coming from Mexico, and has forced some businesses to states like Michigan. But Enrique Peña Nieto's response to the Trump administration has been harshly criticized.
We don't like what the Mexican government has said regarding this situation. We expected the government to have a stronger stance from Trump's campaign. Just saying there will be no wall shows that Mexico's government doesn't understand the real problem and that it hasn't been strong enough.
The tensions have intensified amidst the renegotiation of the NAFTA treaty, as the United States tried to impose their interests above those of Mexico and Canada, and has even threatened to leave the commercial agreement, one that produces $1 billion a day and 6 million jobs in the U.S. only.
The National Congress of Honduras has chosen the Speaker and the Deputy Speakers for the next 4 years, despite continuing protests from the opposition. The government's party won with a majority, thanks to the votes of minor parties, clearing the way for the swearing-in of the elected president this Saturday.
The opposition members were denied the opportunity to speak on the election of the new Congress Speaker and Deputy Speakers. The Speaker will be the same as the last 4 years.
It happened here. What is happening in the streets, the repression, dictatorship, they had it all planned out with corrupt deputies. We were denied the right to speak.
For the legislators, it's about the continuation of Juan Orlando Hernandez's plans, breaking constitutional rights and ignoring local calls to fix the situation.
The call is to the international community to not look the other way, because what is happening to Honduras is really serious, and we don't know how far it can go.
While inside the National Congress, the deputies protested against the re-election of the speaker and deputy speakers, outside the military and the police were blocking the demonstrators. The situation is deemed as a threat to the country, a dictatorship that was built through serious institutional violations.
We are having a rebirth of the 20th century dictatorships, which shows that Honduras elites have managed the country with complete control and power.
Meanwhile, the casualties are rising with 3 new murders in the north of Honduras.
This is an outrage for the Honduran people. They have violated all the processes and murdered the state, and now they are murdering the people.
The presidential inauguration will be held on 27th of January, still some days from now, but the cities already look militarized. The venue of the event hasn't been decided yet.
Time now for another short break. Stay with us. Welcome back. Several European leaders took jabs at U.S. President Donald Trump's policies at the World Economic Forum in Dallas. President Trump is expected to arrive in Switzerland on Thursday.
World leaders are increasingly critical of Trump's America First rhetoric, which has made the U.S. increasingly difficult to forge trade negotiations with. Italian Prime Minister Paolo Gentiloni said leaders can defend their country's interests, but must respect existing international agreements.
It is totally legitimate, understandable, the desire for political leaders to defend their own citizens, their own companies, their own economy. So I respect that. But obviously there is a limit, and the limit is the framework we are all living in.
German Chancellor Angela Merkel addressed the forum saying isolationism and protectionism were not solutions to the economic challenges facing countries around the world.
We believe isolationism will get us nowhere. We believe we have to cooperate, and that protectionism is not the right answer. And we believe that if we share the opinion that things are not being done fairly and the mechanisms aren't reciprocal, then we should look for multilateral solutions and not unilateral ones that ultimately only promotes isolationism and protectionism.
Meanwhile, French President Emmanuel Macron called for a global compact to harness the negative effects of globalization. Macron went further to poke fun at President Trump without calling his name, saying the heavy snowfall might lead some people to question climate change. And while most eyes in Brazil are on that court ruling in Porto Alegre, President Michel Temer has been at the World Economic Forum in Davos to promote his reform agenda. He talked about his policies to scale back Brazil's social security and Brazil's pension system. And he's also joined other world leaders in criticizing protectionism.
My administration, in contrast, has been acting to increasingly integrate Brazil into the global economy and to position the country properly into the international scene by working together with our Mercosur partner nations. We have restored the bloc's original vocation for free market, we have identified trade barriers, and we have been working to remove them.
Trump will have his chance to respond to the critics when he arrives on Thursday.
Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says Canada is working hard to convince U.S. President Donald Trump the NAFTA trade agreement is in the interest of all participating countries. Speaking at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, Trudeau also announced that Canada and 10 other remaining members of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, have ended discussions on a revised agreement for the TPP. It will now be called the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, and it's expected to be signed in March.
Today, I'm pleased to announce that Canada and 10 other remaining members of the Trans-Pacific Partnership concluded discussions in Tokyo, Japan, on a new comprehensive and progressive agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP.
And it's time to take a quick look at some other news happening around the world.
The city of Benghazi killed 35 people and injured 60 others. The first blast hit worshippers leaving a mosque in Benghazi's central district. The second, about 15 minutes later, inflicted a large number of casualties amongst people who had gathered at the scene.
The first explosion was from a car in front of the mosque, and when we came out of our prayers, the injuries were minimal. Only 3 people, I believe. After people had gathered around the area, the second explosion came from another car parked in front of the mosque from a different side, so it was much stronger than the first one. It's as if they were waiting for the people to gather to carry out the explosion.
On April 12th, the ordinary water supply will be shut down and taps will run dry in drought-stricken Cape Town. Residents of the city of 4 million will then be forced to collect a daily water ration of just 25 liters from 200 water collection points, with about 5,000 families for each water collection point. The police and army are ready to be deployed to prevent unrest in the lines.
This means that every resident of Cape Town can only use a maximum of 50 liters per water per day. No matter where you are, where you're at work, whether you're at home, whether you're at any environment, it's 50 liters cumulative for the day.
At least 2 people have been killed in the latest airstrike that targeted the Sadr province in Yemen. The strike brings the number of victims to over 30 people killed and several wounded in military operations over the past 2 days.
And we've come to the end of this news brief. For these and many other stories, you can find them on our website at telespeedtv.net/English. And join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And we're going to end this broadcast with some live images from the Brazilian streets, where people continue to protest the court decision to condemn Lula in different parts of the country. The images that we're bringing to you are live from the streets of Sao Paulo. To tell us your English, I'm Sonia Gray. Thank you so much for watching.
Events told by their main figures. Research findings that transcend our people's